Peter gets the keys of the kingdom in Matthew 16 and is told to bind and loose, which is a reference back to Isaiah 22. And in Isaiah 22, Eliakim is appointed as the palace servant of the palace of the king. And it's important to understand that the palace of the king is an image of the palace of the divine king, God, which is the temple. And the palace of the divine king had palace servants, who we call priests. So the allusion to Isaiah 22 in Matthew chapter 16, in the context of building a temple, or the church, establishes Peter as the priest, or the palace servant, of the temple of Christ, who is, of course, both God and the Davidic king. Isaiah 22 comes up again at the beginning of Revelation, where Jesus has the key of David, opening and shutting the door. In Revelation 2-3, the bishops of the churches are called angels, and they are sent the letters to the 7 churches. And in Revelation 21, we see that the city of God has 12 gates, guarded by 12 angels, who open and shut. This is a reference to the bishops in possession of the keys of the kingdom that were given in Matthew 16 and referred to in Revelation chapter 1 or chapter 3. That Matthew 16 is priestly in character is confirmed by the fact that each apostle is associated with a tribal stone in the city of God, and the stone of Peter is Levi, the priestly tribe. So bishops do indeed fulfill the typology of the ministerial priesthood. So why take the angels at the beginning of Revelation as bishops? Well, there are 2 reasons. First, it makes the most sense of the letters to the 7 churches. The letters are sent to the heads of each local church, who reads them to his congregation. The idea of a letter being sent to a heavenly spirit corresponding to each church makes less sense, as it is the prelates who are responsible for making decisions that safeguard the church. Second, it makes sense within the broader context of Revelation's angelology. Revelation 4-5 shows the ascended Christ surrounded by 24 elders. Note that this is the same word, presbyter. This matches the high priest surrounded by 24 chief priests in the Davidic order. That these elders are angels in Revelation 4-5 is confirmed by the fact that when you go through Revelation, there are exactly 24 angels who act, led by a character called another angel. The other angel is the angel of Yahweh. The phrase another angel comes from Zechariah, where it's a reference to the angel of Yahweh as the pre-incarnate Christ. References to this other angel in Revelation are soaked with theophanic language, with Revelation 10 probably being the most clear example. Revelation 10 has a strong angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a bow, and with his face shining like the sun. This draws heavily on the vision of God in Ezekiel chapter 1. So the angels in chapters 4-5 cast their crowns before the throne, and then act, one by one, throughout the book. In Revelation 20, they are replaced. The 144,000, which of course is 12,000 times 12, were marked as Nazarites in Revelation 7. And in Numbers, the Nazarites have a dedicated head. Dedicated hair is an interpretation, and indeed they do cut off their hair, but that's a symbolic beheading. This is why in Revelation 20, they complete their Nazarite vow with their dedicated head being taken off, which is why they are called beheaded. They take 12 of the thrones, symbolically. The other half of the thrones are taken by the saints of the Old Covenant, who are waiting to ascend and rule with Christ. This is why the saints under the altar in Revelation 6 are described as suffering for the witness that they had borne, rather than the more specific testimony of Jesus, used elsewhere in Revelation to describe the saints of the New Covenant. I take a preterist approach to the book, so the reason for this transfer from angels to man is because Revelation records the end of the Old Covenant, which was given through angels. As Psalm 8 says, for a little while God made man Lord and the angels, but in Revelation man ascends with Christ and is crowned with glory and honor. Revelation records the last liturgy celebrated by Christ in his role as angel of the Lord, and it ends with the session of men in heavenly council surrounding him. The upshot of all of this is that angels are identified as the governors of the old creation, which are replaced by men in the new creation. This is part of the broader distinction between the heavens of God and the earth, In Genesis chapter 1, God begins by creating the heavens and the earth, but then he begins to form and fill and brighten the earth, beginning to bring it to the fullness of its heavenly model, which was created complete and mature. The angels do not develop, they do not reproduce. They are as mature and holy, or as evil, as they ever will be. And that role is continued by man, who, as Genesis 2:4 says, is the generations of the heavens of the earth, the son of the Spirit of God, the heavens, and the feminine dust of the ground, the earth. In Christ, man finally reaches his maturity. Christ is the first grown-up in human history. This is a point made throughout the letter to the Hebrews. And in Revelation, Christ takes up men who are mature in him to sit on thrones with him. So this is why the governors of the churches at the beginning of Revelation are identified as angels. They take the roles that angels leave to them. They are God's counselors. This dovetails perfectly with the symbolism of Christ as the high priest surrounded by his chief priests. The bishops of the churches operate as chief priests surrounding the great high priest. But it's important to understand that when we speak of the priesthood of the church, we don't mean to eliminate the general priesthood of all the baptized. And the general priesthood of all the baptized does fulfill the priesthood of the Old Testament in a particular sense. It fulfills it in the sense that every Christian, no matter whether he's laity, a deacon, a priest, or a bishop, has higher access to the sanctuary than even did the high priest of the Old Testament. This is why in Revelation chapter 7, the saints, the 144,000 saints, are marked as high priests as well as Nazarites. Every Christian has full access to the sanctuary, which is a point made in the epistle to the Hebrews. But when it comes to ministerial function, when it comes to the role of husbanding and guarding and feeding the church, it is the sacramental priesthood of bishops and presbyters that uniquely fulfills the priesthood of the Old Testament. That's a point made in 1 Timothy 2, where Paul says that only men can be ordained in the church. And the reason he says that is because it was the woman who was deceived. Now that's not a declaration that women are dumb or are just easier to deceive. Instead, he's drawing on Genesis chapters 2 and 3, because in Genesis 2, Adam is called to guard the garden. And the first thing that he's challenged to guard is the bride. He's supposed to guard Eve, but instead of guarding her, instead of teaching her the ways of God, he allows the serpent to teach her instead. And that is why bishops and priests typologically fulfill the role of Adam, teaching and feeding the bride of the church. The logic of 1 Timothy 2 requires the ministry of the church to be priestly in character. This all confirms the fascinating thesis that in the New Testament, the Didache, the Apostolic Age, the ministerial prophethood referred to in Acts and Ephesians refers to the bishops. In Ephesians, prophets are an order in the church, which is one level below the order of the apostles. And Paul, in the pastoral epistles, talks about the ordination of prophets, fanning into a flame the gift that Timothy has received by the imposition of hands. Acts repeatedly refers to prophets roving around the church. This is an ordained order in the Apostolic Age. So in my understanding, when you come across the word presbyter or elder in the New Testament, this is just a general word for an ordained minister. It can be a deacon, it can be a priest, it can be a bishop. In the New Testament, the word bishop or episkopos refers to both what we call priests and bishops. But an ordained prophet is what we call a bishop. That's why in the Didache, prophets, when a prophet comes to a local church, that local church is told to allow the prophet to celebrate Eucharist as often as they desire. This is opaque if prophet is just a charismatic order that's called, that's not an ordained order, but it makes a great deal of sense if these were indeed the Eucharistic ministers, the bishops. Prophets are members of the divine council in the Bible. This is why when Abraham is called a prophet in Genesis chapter 15, the first thing you see him doing is interceding with God for Sodom. And then you see him praying for Abimelech, and Abimelech being healed by the prayers of Abraham. Prophets are members of the council, and the theme of Revelation is the elevation of mankind to God's heavenly councils, replacing the angels. That bishops are uniquely called angels indicates their status as prophets. None of this is to deny, of course, that we are all members of God's council under the new covenant. But just as the dead in Christ have a seat on the council intensely in Revelation 20, which is called the first resurrection, remember that prophets are intercessors, and so this has a lot to do with the intercession of the saints. So also are the bishops, counselors in a particularly intense fashion. Their role is to intercede for the people, and importantly, to communicate God's forgiveness to the people. After all, in Isaiah chapter 6, what do we see? We see God surrounded by his heavenly council, asking which counselor he will send. The seraphim, who's an angel, is one of the members of the council, and what does he do? He feeds and forgives. Isaiah says your guilt is atoned for. And that is why bishops have the keys to bind and loose sins. So I hope this video was helpful in illuminating the biblical basis for a lot of ideas which Protestants take issue with. In particular, the priesthood of the church. We do believe in a sacramental priesthood, and that idea is all over the New Testament. In my next video, I hope to expand on these thoughts and explain how the intercession of the saints relates to the heavenly council in the book of Revelation. Thanks for listening.